August 20th, 1962. 3:15 a.m. CIA Headquarters, Langley, Virginia. In the windowless subterranean laboratory of the National Photographic Interpretation Center, the NPIC, a technician carefully guides a wet ribbon of reconnaissance film across a drying rack. This is analog black and white film, flown 70,000 feet above the Earth just hours before. This specific roll captures western Cuba, photographed through the powerful 36-inch focal-length lens of an American U-2 spy plane. Most frames show the expected: sugarcane fields, coastal roads, the geometry of civilian life. But then, on frame 117, the rhythm breaks. The technician freezes. He doesn't need a magnifying glass to see it. Running off a dirt road where no factory or refinery should be is a shadow, a hard rectangular geometry too perfect, like something stamped out by a machine. And parallel to it, 4 identical cigar-shaped shadows casting precise lines in the early morning sun. He knew instantly. That can't be natural terrain. He called for his superior, a man who built this entire discipline, Arthur Lundahl, the chief of the NPIC. Lundahl, a man whose career was founded on the simple principle of seeing what others could only look at, was now looking at evidence of a terrifying and impossible secret. Within 72 hours, that single photograph, frame 117, would expose a hidden Soviet missile base 90 miles from Florida and bring the world within a breath of nuclear war. To understand the sheer weight of frame 117, you must first understand the state of American intelligence in 1962. Aerial reconnaissance, pioneered by aircraft like the U-2, was the only reliable eye America had behind the Iron Curtain. But that eye was blinkered. The downing of U-2 pilot Francis Gary Powers in 1960 proved that these high-altitude flights were vulnerable. Intelligence was slow, risky, and incredibly hard to analyze. The raw film arrived from 70,000 feet, but the data, the truth, was only inches wide. A misplaced smudge, a tricky shadow, or a slight error in trigonometry could send the entire government down a false path. A mistake here didn't just cost money. A wrong interpretation in this geopolitical climate could start a world war. This reality defined Lundahl's team. They were not spies or code breakers. They were analysts, masters of pattern recognition. They worked 18-hour shifts under red light lamps, their tools being a stereoscope, a magnifying glass, and an unforgiving obsession with geometry. Like Charles Lindbergh with his fuel consumption math, Lundahl's doctrine was not instinct, but proof. They studied Soviet field manuals, cross-referenced construction techniques, and memorized the faint 2-degree angles of exhaust scars left by missile tests thousands of miles away. Their job was to find the one pattern interrupt, the detail that defied the 99% of known reality. They looked for the contradiction, the perfectly straight line of a camouflaged structure next to the winding chaos of a farm road. They were forensic visual auditors, ensuring that no guesswork entered the final report. This deep analytical credibility meant that when Lundahl pointed at a photo and named an object, the White House listened. The analysts were trained to ignore what they wanted to see and only report what the geometry demanded. That discipline, born of cold, hard math, was about to be put to the ultimate test on a small island 90 miles away. The photo was crucial, but getting it was an act of extreme risk and patience. The intelligence community knew something was happening in Cuba. A massive influx of Soviet shipping was evident, but without photographic proof, they had nothing. The weather over western Cuba was notoriously fickle, frustrating mission planners for weeks. They needed a clean shot. That chance came on October 14th, 1962. At the controls of the U-2 was Major Richard Heiser. The target zone had to be flown just before sunrise or just before sunset, the golden hour for photography, when shadows were longest, revealing the subtle contours of camouflage. Heiser's window was narrow, and reports suggested heavy cloud cover. The mission almost scrubbed. Heiser made the call to punch through, gambling on a small, clear patch of sky. He flew his prescribed, meticulously plotted route. 70,000 feet above the Cuban countryside, Heiser felt the loneliness of the job, unaware that his flight path was taking him directly over a site under furious construction, the one containing the secret objects. The mission was successful, but the tension didn't end there. Immediately upon landing in Texas, the raw film canisters were sealed and rushed by jet courier to Florida, then transferred to a secure flight bound for Andrews Air Force Base outside D.C. From there, a black sedan screamed toward Langley. This analog data, the only hope for confirmation, was entirely dependent on human speed. Back in the NPIC darkroom, the clock was ticking down the minutes to when the heavy reel of film could finally be immersed in the developer. It took Lundahl and his core team hours, not minutes, to process the initial discovery on frame 117. The first prints were 9 by 9 inches, too coarse for definitive proof. They needed detail. They needed depth. They immediately turned to the stereoscope. This simple device allowed them to view two adjacent frames taken slightly seconds apart, merging the images in the mind to create a 3D view. This parallax effect was their secret weapon against Cuban camouflage. It proved what they were looking at was not a flat, painted canvas cover over farm equipment, but solid, three-dimensional objects. They confirmed the large, permanent rectangular structures, the control bunkers, and the distinct geometry of 4 parallel lines that looked like launch pads. Now came the unforgiving math. Knowing the U-2's precise altitude, 70,000 feet, and the sun's exact position at the moment of the photograph, a calculated 43-degree angle, the analysts used simple trigonometry to calculate the true height and length of the shadows. The results were chillingly uniform. The long, cigar-shaped shadows measured almost precisely 22 meters long by 2 meters wide. They cross-referenced this number not against assumptions but against primary intelligence, Soviet training and field manuals often smuggled out years before. There was a single terrifying match. The Soviet R-12 medium-range ballistic missile, NATO designation SS-4 Sandal, and its accompanying articulated transporter vehicle. The geometry of the shadows perfectly matched the known geometry of the SS-4. The room fell silent. It wasn't a guess. It was a mathematical certainty. The objects weren't just missile components. The parallel arrangement indicated a fully operational launch facility, constructed with terrifying speed. In that moment, frame 117 didn't just expose a secret base, it exposed a reality. The Cuban defensive shield was actually an offensive nuclear dagger, pointed directly at Washington, D.C. and half the American eastern seaboard. The analysts had the geometry, but the president needed conviction. Lundahl spent the next day preparing his case as an undeniable mathematical proof. On the morning of October 15th, he walked into the presence of McGeorge Bundy, Kennedy's national security advisor, and laid out his exhibit. The first response was one of disbelief, then skepticism. This was the moment of resistance, the point where cold doctrine clashes with inconvenient truth. Intelligence officials, wary of jumping to conclusions, offered the expected counter-argument that the nation could not risk World War III over a mere shadow and an assumption. They insisted that the evidence was ambiguous, suggesting the objects were likely large canvas covers, irrigation equipment, or simple construction materials for a sugar mill. Lundahl didn't argue. Like the P-38 pilots who doubted Lindbergh's over-square technique, they were skeptical of something that defied their standard operating procedure. Lundahl let the math speak. He produced the enlarged prints, overlaying them with scale rulers and calibrated grids. He showed how the photograph's known sun angle proved the precise 22-meter length of the objects. He then overlaid the image with a wire diagram template of the Soviet SS-4 transporter, derived from test site photos in Kazakhstan. The fit was exact, a perfect congruence of dimensions. But Lundahl went further. He demonstrated the context of the photo. He showed the 6 main features of a field-deployed Soviet MRBM, medium-range ballistic missile site. The parallel lines for the missiles, the fueling area, the oxidizer dome, the control bunker, the tent camp, and the security perimeter. Frame 117 showed 4 of the 6 features already under construction. This was a ready-made threat being assembled with furious haste. This briefing was later repeated, with the same irrefutable presentation for President Kennedy and the ex-com later that day. The stakes had moved from an intelligence analysis problem to a survival decision. The difference between irrigation gear and a nuclear missile base came down to one thing: Lundahl's unwavering discipline. The briefing shattered the ambiguity. The resistance was crushed not by rank, but by data. Yet Kennedy could not initiate a global confrontation based on a single image, no matter how precisely measured. He needed confirmation. He needed a trial. The discovery on October 15th triggered a new phase of intense, high-risk reconnaissance. Kennedy needed a second, definitive photograph, both to confirm the initial finding and to track the rate of construction. The dilemma was immediate. Flying the U-2 again dramatically increased the risk of detection and potential shootdown. If a pilot was lost, the Soviets could claim the US was an aggressor, tipping the world toward war before the facts were even confirmed. But the risk was necessary. On the morning of October 16th, just 12 hours after Lundahl's presentation, another U-2 pilot, flying a slightly different path, captured a sequence of images over the same location. The team at NPIC worked with frantic speed. They didn't just look for SS-4 components, they looked for change. They took the original frame 117 and, using precise map coordinates, overlaid it digitally with the new photos. This comparative analysis revealed the terrifying rate of Soviet progress. The construction had intensified overnight. New features, more transporters, more fuel staging equipment, had appeared. The geometry of the threat was not only confirmed, it was expanding. This process of using pattern repetition and time series comparison became the decisive factor. The single shadow from frame 117 was now part of a growing, undeniable pattern. The visual math was correct, and the reality was escalating. Lundahl and his analysts had given Kennedy the proof he needed. The SS-4 missile had an estimated range of 1,100 miles. A range arc graphic, overlaid on a map of the United States, showed the potential reach from the Cuban site. Target zones included Washington, D.C., Atlanta, Dallas, and the Panama Canal. The image was no longer an academic curiosity or a technical riddle. It was an existential threat. The analysis proved the hypothesis correct. Now, the president had to decide what to do with the proof. The technical question had been answered. The political question remained: what is the cost of confrontation? The trial was over. The math had delivered the verdict. Now the scene was shifting from the dark room to the light table, where the fate of the world would be decided. October 16th, 1962. The scene shifted to the cabinet room. This was the moment the technical analysis of Arthur Lundahl intersected directly with geopolitical command. For the next 13 days, this group, known as XCOM, would meet here, their focus entirely on the enlarged, grainy evidence of frame 117. The president himself, John F. Kennedy, tested the evidence one last time. He demanded to know if the intelligence was absolute. Lundahl's response was unwavering. He was as sure as a man could be from a photograph. The geometry was exact. The shadows on the print, when calculated using the sun's angle, matched the dimensions of the Soviet SS-4 missile transporters within a margin of inches. It was not conjecture. It was mathematical certainty. This proof immediately clashed with military instinct. The Joint Chiefs of Staff pushed hard for an immediate massive airstrike to neutralize the missile sites. Their doctrine was clean and swift, preemptive attack before the threat was complete. But Lundahl's precision provided the president with a critical counter-insight. The photographic evidence, especially the time series comparisons, confirmed that while construction was accelerating, the missiles were not yet fully armed or ready to fire. This detail, measured by the analysts, gave the administration a narrow, precious window of operational time that pure military aggression would have squandered. The geometry had given them the capacity to choose a different path. The threat of an immediate strike risked triggering a catastrophic Soviet response. Instead, Kennedy chose a calculated decision, a naval quarantine, an ultimatum based not on political assertion, but on the clear, irrefutable photographic evidence they possessed. The analysis of a single shadow, measured in meters and degrees, had bought the world 13 days. Lundahl's quiet, disciplined work had triumphed, forcing a new doctrine of strategic patience against the instinct for war. The resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Soviets agreeing to withdraw the missiles, was a staggering victory for diplomacy, but it was also a staggering victory for the specific measurable discipline demonstrated by Arthur Lundahl's team. The technical knowledge had given the political leadership an advantage that was previously considered impossible: verified, actionable intelligence that was so precise it could withstand the highest-level diplomatic scrutiny. Like Lindbergh's over-square technique, which was adopted unit by unit until it became standard doctrine across the entire Air Force, the NPIC's methodology was rapidly diffused and scaled up across the entire American intelligence apparatus. Before October 1962, the interpretation of reconnaissance film was often considered an art, relying on the analyst's experience and instinct. After Frame 117, it became a science. The entire concept of photographic interpretation, PI, was restructured around pattern recognition, sun-angle trigonometry, and time series analysis. This new discipline demanded that every claim be backed by verifiable geometry. The motto, "No guesswork, geometry," transitioned from Lundahl's personal maxim to an institutional mandate. NPIC's training budget exploded. Analysts from across the Army, Navy, and Air Force were sent to Langley to learn Lundahl's methods. They learned how to use the stereoscope not just to see depth, but to measure height differences down to the millimeter, proving the size of a structure hiding under camouflage netting. They learned how to calculate the exact angle of an object's shadow to determine its height, even when the object itself was obscured. The impossible, identifying a missile base from a shadow, was becoming routine. Perhaps the most significant impact was on the nascent space program. While the U-2 was vulnerable, the future was in space. The secret Corona satellite program was already launching film cameras into orbit, capturing vast swathes of the globe. But without the proper interpretation methodology, this space-based data was merely a flood of film. Lundahl's staff, armed with the new, validated doctrine of comparative scaling and pattern indexing, became the first corps of satellite imagery interpretation specialists. They took the principles proven by the 9 by 9-inch U-2 photograph and applied them to the kilometers of film returned by Corona. Frame 117 wasn't just a relic of the Cuban crisis. It became the Rosetta Stone for interpreting the Cold War from space. This analytical rigor also planted the seeds for the future of automated intelligence. The need to quickly cross-reference missile sites against known blueprints and to rapidly calculate dimensions inspired the earliest attempts to use computers for image recognition. The analysts were, in effect, teaching machines to see patterns, taking their human-discovered geometric algorithms and translating them into code. The technique spread. The range of intelligence options, like the range of the P-38, expanded exponentially. Every subsequent crisis, every new Soviet development, was first checked against the ironclad standard set by Lundahl and Frame 117. The lesson was clear: precision equals power. You don't defeat doctrine with argument, you defeat it with irrefutable data. The world collectively exhaled when the Soviet ships turned back and the missiles were removed from Cuba. It was a diplomatic triumph, but history often forgets the technical foundation of that victory. The strategic impact of Frame 117 was quantifiable, and it reset the clock on the Cold War. Consider the cost of failure. The military option favored by the Joint Chiefs, a massive airstrike, carried a nearly 100% probability of Soviet retaliation, potentially triggering the exchange of thermonuclear weapons. The total cost of the crisis was 13 days of global paralysis and the risk of billions of lives. Now consider the cost of the analysis. It cost the fuel for one U-2 flight, the chemicals in a darkroom, and the obsessive, meticulous time of Arthur Lundahl and his dozen analysts. This technical investment, based on geometry and not guesswork, delivered the certainty needed to choose the narrow path of quarantine. The technical discovery didn't just prevent a war, it defined a new kind of power. The power of verified intelligence. The focus returns to the threat itself. The SS-4 Sandal missile was a game-changer for the Soviets. With its 1,100-mile reach from Cuba, it could hit every major city in the American southeast. But the true shift in the strategic landscape wasn't the SS-4's range. It was the fact that the US knew its range, knew its exact position, and knew its construction timeline with near-perfect certainty. Before Cuba, The strategic game was based on the missile gap, a belief, often exaggerated by politicians, that the Soviet Union possessed a vast numerical superiority in intercontinental missiles. This uncertainty fueled anxiety and massive defense spending. The technical victory of Frame 117 forced a profound psychological and doctrinal shift. The emphasis moved from massive blind production to measured capability. Kennedy and subsequent administrations realized that true deterrence wasn't just about how many missiles you had, but how much you knew about the other side's deployment. This marked the end of the missile gap era and the beginning of the age of strategic verification. The ability to use geometry and pattern recognition to hold the Soviets accountable for their actual deployments, not their bluster, changed everything. Treaties like the SALT agreements later in the decade, aimed at limiting nuclear arms, would have been impossible without the absolute certainty that spy satellites, using Lundahl's methodology, could verify compliance. You can't negotiate arms reduction if you can't trust what you're seeing. The entire Cold War shifted. It became less about who could build more bombs and more about who could accurately count the other side's bombs. The NPIC analysis was a cost-effective alternative to massive military escalation. It established intelligence as the essential prerequisite for diplomacy, transforming the blurry reality of the Cold War into a precisely measured, geometrical problem. This technical legacy endures today. Every satellite image, every drone feed, every piece of global intelligence, from spotting humanitarian disasters to tracking supply chains, relies on the same core principles established by Arthur Lundahl's team. Cross-reference, measure the shadow, and never rely on anything but geometric proof. The stakes were clear in 1962. A single, 22-meter shadow, measured down to the inch, provided the data that saved the world from itself, justifying the entire costly, risky U-2 program in a single, terrifying, perfect photograph. History, being fond of drama, tends to simplify the Cuban Missile Crisis into a game of political chicken between two powerful men. But the story of Frame 117 is often misrepresented by three powerful myths that obscure the real technical victory. The first myth is that the Soviet construction was invisible. In the classic telling, the CIA stumbles upon a perfectly hidden secret. The reality is that the Soviets were effective, using netting and positioning their sights deep within dense terrain. But Lundahl's team proved that camouflage is a game of hiding surface features, not volumetric geometry. You can hide the object's body, but you cannot eliminate its shadow. The 22-meter shadow, casting a perfect 43-degree line in the morning sun, was the fundamental constant that betrayed the entire operation. The geometry, as always, was uncamouflageable. The second myth, the stroke of genius. Many histories credit a single anonymous analyst for having an aha moment. This turns the process into luck, not doctrine. The truth is, Frame 117 was the result of a scientific, repeatable protocol. The NPIC team didn't guess it was a missile. They proved it, using the exact sun-angle trigonometry they had practiced for years on test ranges in Kazakhstan. The system was designed precisely to eliminate genius and replace it with verifiable measurement. And the third, most dangerous myth is that the crisis was solved cleanly. The geopolitical situation was anything but simple. Even with Lundahl's proof, the crisis was volatile. On October 27th, toward the end of the 13 days of confrontation, a U-2 was shot down over Cuba, killing pilot Major Rudolf Anderson. This single event, coming after Frame 117 had already done its work, brought the world back to the brink, testing Kennedy's resolve. The missile-by-shadow evidence had given them the time and the confidence to endure this incredible pressure. But the price of verification was still paid in blood. The lesson of the myths is that the technical rigor, the boring, meticulous geometry of the darkroom, was the only thing that stood between political ambition and nuclear war. The true hero wasn't a spy or a general. It was the scientific method applied to visual data. The story of Frame 117 is a story about the ultimate power of precision. It closes the loop we opened with Charles Lindbergh. Lindbergh, with his over-square math, gave the P-38 Lightning a range that defied doctrine, changing air superiority forever. Arthur Lundahl, with his shadow math, gave the American president a strategic range that defied military doctrine, changing the Cold War forever. Both men found safety and success in the geometry of the unseen. Lindbergh found his margin of fuel safety in the efficiency calculation of an RPM that seemed too low. Lundahl found his margin of global safety in the length calculation of a shadow that seemed too long. In both cases, the technical truth, the cold, verifiable data, provided the essential counterweight to instinct and assumption. Lindbergh's math moved the pilot away from full throttle to maximum endurance. Lundahl's math moved the president away from preemptive strike to quarantine. The discipline of engineering and the discipline of intelligence became one. The maximum range of any endeavor is determined not by ambition, but by meticulous calculation. The lasting legacy of that 22-meter shadow is in the very structure of the modern world. Today, the principles of time series analysis and geometric verification, born in the NPIC darkroom, are the unwritten rules of international affairs. Every arms control treaty, from SALT to START, relies entirely on the capability that Lundahl demonstrated, the certainty that you can verify compliance from thousands of miles away, turning vast, confusing intelligence into small, measurable data points. The ability to count missiles, to confirm troop movements, or to track illicit nuclear construction using nothing more than geometry, has stabilized the world by replacing fear of the unknown with the facts of the known. The crisis taught the world that in the nuclear age, the most powerful weapon is information derived from irrefutable measurement. Arthur Lundahl went on to help found the National Reconnaissance Office, ensuring that the scientific rigor he pioneered became permanent, institutional doctrine. He never sought the spotlight, preferring the quiet confidence of the man who knew that his answers, once given, were unassailable. And the next time you see a satellite map, or read about a global incident verified by orbital photography, remember the lesson of frame 117. That picture didn't just expose a Cuban missile base. It exposed the geometry of global power. It was the moment that the careful work of technicians, measuring shadows in a darkroom, saved the world in the light.